well. And thank you to our virtual audience for your patience while we mingled and got some drinks and food and reconnected. I'm Alison Cove, founder and CEO of USEFULL. We're based here in this building, and we do returnable takeout packaging, specifically cups and bowls with tracking technology as well. Plastic free, hence my shirt. I'm not sure if those in the audience can see it, but hot girls do hate plastic. So we're entirely plastic free. And that's for two reasons. One is I'm incredibly selfish and I don't like to put toxic things in my body. And the second reason is for environmental reasons. So still selfish, but maybe a little less selfish. We all know where plastic ends up, and it's not anywhere good. So with that, I would love to have the panelists each introduce themselves. These are folks that I have worked with over the years that I respect tremendously, and am so excited to have a conversation tonight about policy and why it matters in our reuse revolution. So with that, Kirsty's going to kick it off because she's next to me.
My name is Kirsty Pecci. I'm the executive director of Just Zero. We're a nonprofit that's soup to nuts, anti-incineration, anti-landfilling, pro good reuse systems, pro composting, pro true circularity, I would say. And we work across the country. And what nonprofit means to us is we don't take money from folks who do bad things, pure and simple. And we started last year, and we're really enjoying this work and really hope to be really glad to be here and really excited to see the rest of the panel. A lot of folks are people that I admire and have worked with for a long time.
All right, Susan and Janice, you're next because you're up on the screen right now.
Okay. Yes. Thank you for having us. And we're coming in from Marin County, Mill Valley, California. And we're here representing really the work that we're doing that's includes our community group that got started in 2018 called Plastic Free Marin. And we're both going to give you just a little bit about some context. And in early 2018, a group of us got together, part of the local Sierra Club group, and we wanted to do something, take some substantive action to mitigate this climate crisis. So we looked at what could we do that would really at least be representative of the problem. And we all agreed, let's go after single-use plastic foodware. Ubiquitous on our beaches, in our waterways, and really such gratuitous waste. So that was the inception of Plastic Free Marin, and we set out a strategy of, we knew it was going to be really important it was behavior change and awareness and education, but it was really important to change the system. So our strategy included getting a new policy, an ordinance passed at our county level. And so we started meeting with our governing board, the Board of Supervisors, individually. And we made our case why we really needed an ordinance to start to outlaw a lot of this plastic foodware waste. And it turned out, you always look at, are there any examples of this? And that's how we met Janice. I met Janice. This was very early on in our inception. And she had already been working on this in one of the towns in Marin County, of which there's like a dozen, San Anselmo. So I'm going to turn it over to Janice and talk a little bit about that, the ordinance wording.
Yeah, so the ordinance, so I came up into all of this by happenstance. Really, I was coming off of a career of sustainable apparel, from farm to closet. I did everything, mostly design work and work in factories and things like that. So anyways, coming off of that, and I want to do more for my community. And so I thought, I'm going to join the San Anselmo Sustainability Commission. And when I got in there, it was just the time when we were all figuring out, okay, what do we want to work on? And I said, okay, I want to work on single-use plastics. So I just dove into writing an ordinance for our town, so a reusable foodware ordinance. And that's how I met Susan and the group from Plastic Free Marin. And it just happened that they were amazing environmentalists, organizers, and I had no idea about government or policy or anything. And so we all kind of worked on this together, and we rallied around San Anselmo, and it was adopted in 2019. And then we soon after rallied around Fairfax, which is the town right next door, and that was adopted. And then we worked for a year to rally around the whole county. So it's been adopted in the whole county. It's going to start being enforced on November 10th here. And there's only one jurisdiction that did not adopt it. So yeah.
So it was approved by the board in May of 2022 with an 18-month runway. And it's rather simple in the provisions of it, but it's pretty major change. And it's just the main things are, we want to reduce a lot of this gratuitous waste. So if you're a restaurant and you have in dining, you've got to use reusables. We also want to make sure that BYO is really encouraged, or reusable services are encouraged. So we're setting a price signal on single-use cups, of which Marin County goes through 95 million a year for our little 260,000 population. And beyond that, we, in terms of circularity, we want what is labeled compostable for takeout packaging to truly be compostable. And, all the bioplastics we say no to.
And then I want to add on that our focus actually now, I mean, we're going to continue to do this because it's new, it's fluid, it's going to be growing. And of course, it's all about behavior change. But Susan and I did do a pilot with USEFULL and 2 towns in our county, and it was very successful. It's still going on, but we came out of the pilot wanting to scale it throughout Marin County. So that's our next big focus for us. And we're working on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And it's really cool for me to see leaders in the community space. Before we get over to Madhavi, I just want to highlight that right now, USEFULL is primarily focused on college campuses, closed loop environments, corporate campuses. We do have a few community-based implementations, of which 2 of the stars are on the screen right now, Susan and Janice. Our other star is out on Martha's Vineyard, Island Eats, MB, and Jessica out there. Those are 2 communities that are really at the forefront. So next, I want to introduce Madhavi, who is at the forefront in her own right. And the Cape is, she's based on the Cape, and the Cape is about to really lead the way somewhere that's driving distance from here. So I'm going to stand over here while Madhavi introduces herself and her work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madhavi Venkatesan, and I am the founder and executive director of Sustainable Practices. We are a Cape-based nonprofit focused on environmental activism, basically in looking at different ways in which we can reduce the human footprint on the Cape, but ultimately the planet by example using the Cape. I also teach at Northeastern in the economics department. I started Sustainable Practices in 2016. We actually started doing our work in 2017 with the film festival, and that has now gone into 7 years as a film series that we have through the Chatham Orpheum Theater. I found that documentary film is the best way to connect with people because it really captures within a very short period of time a lot of information. But on top of it, when people have visual connection with things, it also unleashes their empathy or their connectivity to an issue. So that was really the primary conduit of our activism. In 2018, I shared a film called Divide and Conquered, which basically is a documentary of the first plastic bottle ban, commercial single-use plastic water bottle ban, in the United States, but also in the world. It happened here right outside Boston in Concord, Mass, started by a woman named Jean Hill, who unfortunately is no longer with us. But I really encourage you, if you have a chance to watch the film, it's really inspiring. I've seen it over 30 times, but on top of that, it also gives you an understanding of how the state of Massachusetts handles regulation. We as citizens in the state of Massachusetts can basically file a citizen's petition looking for a change, any kind of change that we wish to see in our local governments for those towns that actually participate in a town meeting process. So Cape Cod is made up of 15 towns, 14 of which have a town meeting process. Barnstable County, the largest county where Hyannis is located, does not have that type of government as a representative town council. We filed single-use plastic bottle ban efforts across all 15 towns, starting with the municipal ban, which is what San Francisco currently has in effect. That has been passed and adopted in all 15 towns as of 2021, with the last one being Truro that passed that year. Since then, we also started, because we started that action in January of 2019, we started an action in January of 2020. Unfortunately, we were slowed because of COVID for elimination of retail sale of single-use plastic water bottles, period. And we passed in 9 towns so far. We have 6 more to go. This year, we started a new initiative at the beginning of January, which is the Plastic Reduction Initiative, which eliminates all plastic takeout ware from restaurants. So restaurants can no longer provide their food as a takeout item in plasticware. We do not have USEFULL adopted on the Cape, but we are hoping that USEFULL would be an appropriate mechanism for some of these restaurants. There are challenges to restaurants that are basically, for all practical purposes, fast food entities. So we have to find alternative mechanisms in place there so that we can find a way to reduce that footprint. We haven't exactly found that yet. And we are trying to champion the reuse effort here. It has been very, very challenging. And I'm sure that the arguments as to why it's been challenging will be very common amongst all of us, because the same arguments are used over and over. So I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I do want to say that I didn't invite people here just because they use USEFULL, although, you know, it's a big plus, Susan and Janice. The other 2 folks that aren't able to make it tonight, one is Rep. Sokola from Lexington, Massachusetts. She heads the Zero Waste Caucus at the State House, right across the river. And in fact, the Zero Waste Caucus met today. There's a lot of great work happening on Beacon Hill. And I know we'll talk more about that in their absence. The other person that wasn't able to make it is from the New England Aquarium. James is head of policy or some equivalent title. And they have a blue economy package bill up at the State House as well. Included within that is a circular economy bill, just really focusing on spurring the circular economy in Massachusetts, and something that we've worked with them on as well. So with that, I would love to understand a little bit about, maybe, Christy, you could tell us a little bit about the landscape locally of reuse or zero waste bans. I know Madhavi highlighted a bit about the Cape. If you could just give a high level landscape view of it.
Sure. So, when I do this, I think about this work in terms of what is truly circular. As I think I mentioned already, we don't want to just be banning one thing and then be using something else that's a single-use product that may or may not contain plastic. We want to make sure that we're thinking about, and this was already said, systems and systems change, right? And that's why reuse is not a cup. It's a system, right? To reuse that cup. That's really what's the key here. So in New England and in the United States, most of what we've seen in regards to plastic fall in a few different buckets. We've seen bans, and some of those bans, for instance, plastic grocery bags, some of the initial plastic grocery bags resulted in thicker plastic grocery bags being used, right? Then as policy language improved and we learned our lessons, and again, a lot of times we have to thank California because they go first. And then we say, oh, well, we got to tweak that, California, and then we tweak it. So, we appreciate that and we know how hard this is. that, for instance, for grocery bag bans, we need them to have stitched handles. So it's not just a cord handle, and they have to be machine washable. They can't be washable because then Walmart has a whole bunch of bags that you can wash with detergent or whatever, spray them, but they're not machine washable. So we have to be very careful on how we draft these things. That's one example. Another example is that we've seen some of these great bans happening, like what Mahogany has done on the Cape. That has put tremendous pressure on the beverage industry, which I greatly appreciate. However, banning water bottles, plastic water bottles, is just the first step. As she said, she's continuing to do these other bans, in part because we don't want it just to be cartons, plastic lined cartons of water that are used instead, right? So we continue to find these different pieces and to put pressure on the system in different ways, but we have to make sure that we're thinking about systems. So when we look at reuse systems and the pieces that have happened locally, they have helped very much in stopping and changing the dialogue at the state or federal level, but we have to make sure that we're thinking about ultimately what the goal is. And the ultimate goal is non-toxic, which means no plastic. Reusable systems, when that means systems that are localized. It has to be between 100 and 300 miles. You have to have something that's moving within that distance to be rewashed and reused. The system needs to be scalable. It can't just be a pilot. We have to start with the pilot. I love pilots, but for instance, the refill pilot in Oregon that we've seen for refilling beer hasn't gotten that much bigger. It's about 2 million bottles a year still. It's not across Oregon. So it needs to be scalable, and there needs to be a mechanism within that system to drive that scalability and to pay for it. So in other words, your law, ordinance, or system has to have some kind of funding mechanism, whether it's a handling fee or a fee that the customer pays or something that makes it sustainable or that saves the companies that are paying money so that they know that they want to do this. The cheapest way to bottle beverages, if you're responsible for the end life of the bottle, is reusable glass. But you have to be responsible for the end life of the bottle or you don't have skin in the game. And then lastly, I would say that transparency and reporting are always important. So one of the crucial elements as we do these great local bans that are so important is just what was just said about Marin County. Are you kidding me? That's a lot of coffee cups for 250,000 people, you said? God, you're caffeinated, you people. Holy mackerel. Have some juice.
It's also juice.
Wow.
It's any to-go drink.
Yeah.
No, I know. I'm teasing. I'm teasing. You don't have to tell me. Yeah. But the point being that number and then how it changes, the litter change, the number change, the cost change, and how businesses can save money. But again, it has to be first driven by the requirement. And that's what we're seeing in Europe. That's what we're seeing in Canada. Any good system, there's a catalyst. There's a responsibility that's put on the corporation that then makes this all work. And then it will scale up, not just be something that I do, not just my reusable mug, it's all of our reusable cups, right? That's where we need to go. Does that start us off where you want to do?
That absolutely starts us off really well. And I would love to open it up to Susan Janice Madavi and Christy too, to start to think about what the vision for the future looks like. We're in this pilot stage in Europe, glorified pilot stage in Europe, glorified pilot stage in a few places in the US. Where do we look in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? And then when we're all in the nursing home, what does it look like?
I'm not going to a nursing home.
Okay, fair.
I'm going to die in my home.
Metaphorically.
Happy to give my response to that, if I could start that off.
Go for it.
I mean, the issue in the United States, first, I mean, we can't really compare ourselves necessarily to Europe or any other country for that matter without thinking about the contextual basis of how each country operates, the way in which people within that country see themselves in relationship to one another. In our country, we are extremely individualistic, and there's also a huge differential in terms of people's understanding. Oftentimes we hear this mantra of education, but unfortunately we have the ability to turn off any education. We don't want to hear. So we often end up speaking to people who are already believers as opposed to educating those people that we wish to jump on the bandwagon. And we also suffer from another issue, which is this concept of consensus. Consensus, when you have this kind of issue that we're talking about right now with plastic pollution and the toxicity elements and its impact for years to come, is not exactly a winning argument. Consensus cannot happen because of some of the attributes I've just said. I can rattle off many others. We have to sit back and think to ourselves, what is in the best interest of society at large, and recognize that sometimes consensus only leads to the lowest common denominators will being heard and dominating the argument. The other thing I would just like to say, I know that there's this interest in having corporations change, but the one thing we also have to take into consideration is if you don't have a population that is sensitive to the issue itself, corporate change doesn't really have to occur for any meaningful way because there's no one that they are responsible to. There's got to be some amount of responsibility on the part of the customer as well as the corporation, but also on the part of the investor who's buying into these stocks or buying the corporate debt, looking for a payout because they're helping fund those corporations and their continued growth. So in the end, we have to recognize that it's all three. In some cases, sometimes it's going to be the corporation, but they'll be taking the lead only because they're incentivized with regard to their own financial return, brand premium, or markets. And sometimes it's going to be the customer, and sometimes it's going to be the government. But the problem is that none of these entities are working together. They're all working in silo, which is making it very challenging for us to move forward on this issue. The only thing that binds all three is each of us individually, because we are all three embodied in one person. We just have to start working collectively together to be able to make these changes occur in terms of the kinds of companies we buy stocks in, to the types of products we choose to buy, to the people we elect into office. All three have to finally start working together. And I think that's one issue that's not happening. So will that happen before I die? I don't know. Unfortunately, people seem to only come together when a crisis really erupts, and this crisis is only just starting.
So Madhavi, I know we didn't prep this answer, so it's okay if you don't know or we didn't prep this question, so it's okay if you don't know the answer, but you talk about stocks and buying stocks, and maybe, I don't know if you know about the SEC reporting that's being required, or Kirsty or anyone else, but is that a step forward? And I know, or maybe for myself, I know it can be a little daunting when I'm looking at buying stocks for my 401k or for whatever, what is truly responsible versus what's greenwashing. You know, that they're like ESG funds that I just say, yes, that's great, I want that. But what can we as the layperson do to think about that third leg of the stool?
Well, first of all, I think the first thing people need to do is to look and see the top rated ESG companies relative to the top companies listed in the S&P 500. If you're seeing that they're almost exactly the same, I think that's telling you something right there. ESG is something you can buy into by meeting certain self-stated metrics. I don't believe ESG is a very successful strategy at all for many, many reasons. One of the simplest ones is how Walmart got a greater points on their ESG scores by just creating debt to help them build a windmill farm. They could have financed it alternatively, but green bonds gives you points on the ESG scale. So the issue here is the issue here is the desire to have someone else certify something based on criteria you don't even know, so that you don't have to be engaged in the actual understanding of where these things are coming from. So the SEC is requiring potentially climate disclosures. But again, if you don't understand what those climate disclosures mean, it's not necessarily going to impair the company. The company is only going to be impaired to the extent that the investor cares about what they read and understands it. And we have a dumbing down of America that continues and continues and continues, with people looking for someone else to make the decisions for them and saying that somebody said this, so therefore it's okay. That way I can continue to live the way I have been without taking personal responsibility or accountability. So I just think it's just another way. We started with CSR, then we moved to ESG, now we have climate disclosures. I don't know that it's necessarily going to mean anything because we have a divided country in terms of the perceptions of personal responsibility.
Very interesting. All right, now switching gears, unless Susan and Janice, you have anything to add to this topic of.
I have a question, if I can't say.
Madhavi.
Madhavi, sorry, could elaborate on, I see what you're saying about, the three individuals that need to come together to get some things done, but how do you, I don't know, engage, do you have anything that you can elaborate on how to do that? Because it comes down to behavior change, and how do you, quantify that with these three things?
Well,
Economic
they're not meant to be three separate things within us. I'm a member of the government. I have a right to vote. I also have an income, and I put some of it away in retirement. So I do make investment decisions, and I go to the store and I decide how I consume. So each one of us is all three. We all have membership in all three silos. The fact that we're not engaged with the power that we have individually within those silos is a problem. And the fact that we tend to be so busy that we don't collectivize our individual interests into something more powerful is also an issue. So in terms of behavioral change can be done through many, many different methods. One of them using economic tools such as taxes or constraints or bans, elimination of choice. But the problem is that you also have to convey the intention of those regulations, as Kirsty brought up with regard to the plastic bag bans. If the intention is not necessarily formulated or specified or understood, all that you have is a circumvention of the language of the law to meet the language criteria, but not the intention. So behavioral change isn't going to come from everybody, and I don't anticipate everyone buying in. It only needs to come from about maybe 60% of the people actually engaging in some sort of change without pushing back on it. And the question of how we get there is probably one thing that we're not very good at doing. When we talk about public policies, it starts at a grassroots level. It's basically what the bottlers and every other entity does to make money. They have stakeholder engagement programs that reach out to people based on what incentivizes them. So we need to stop looking at individuals as a monolith, that somehow they have to understand this given the education or information we give, and give information to people based on what incentivizes their behavior. And I think once we start to do that and do that well, the changes will be fairly quick.
I just want to say that, to bring this down maybe at a more grounded level right now, I mean, what we've tried to do is really work very much at a local level. At a local level to create system change, and with system change, which is driven by behavior change or expectations of interested people. So, I mean, we've just seen what we've been able to do. And from this, we're already driving innovation. We have businesses contacting us about the new ordinance and what they're doing with new fiber and compostable packaging without PFAS chemicals. So I don't know. I mean, I do think, and it's inspiring, and we need this, that, the axiom or that hope is in action. I really do think that if you can get involved locally for whatever, you're really interested in, you can really drive change. And driving change brings a new normalization of behavior, new expectations. And so that's just maybe from the macro to the micro.
If I can fill in a little bit of the middle too, I'll be the creamy center of this. So what I would say is that I agree with everything that's been said. What we see at the state level for change, right? For actual laws being passed at the state level, and especially in the larger city level, is we see that, a tremendous amount of lobbying by corporations. So there's investment and there's purchasing power, and then there's the lobbying. What we've also seen, which has been really awesome around plastic since I started at Conservation Law Foundation in January 2017. It was a new session. We were talking about what laws should be proposed in Massachusetts, and they didn't want to talk about plastics the way they do now. That's not that long ago. So the information that's out there, two things. One, you can, while there is a dumbing down of society, most definitely, we all use the pronouns me and I incorrectly when it's the object and the preposition. We know that, all right? We do it all the time. There's a lot of things we're not as educated as we should be on, but you can do a deep dive on your phone at any moment. You can look up how dangerous PVC is and find out what it is at any moment. That is incredible. My cousin's daughter is a freshman in college right now. And when I think about how she has to write a paper compared to what I used to have to do to find the resources and walk from library to library and copy everything, photocopy everything, and then type it out, because we didn't have cut and paste, it's fucking amazing, right? So this is a poor type of speaking. So in some ways that information has spread like wildfire. Michael O'Haney from Story of Stuff said, and I quote him all the time, we have won the war on how dangerous plastic is. We have. People don't want it in their placentas. They really don't, okay? And so that is something that we all are really worried about and concerned about, and that's real. What we haven't done is pushed back against the baloney, the false circular economy baloney, the false sustainability baloney, the false baloney that all these the greenwashing these corporations are doing. That's our problem. So what we have to do is evaluate any reusable, refillable program, as I said, and see, is it toxic? You know, you mentioned PFAS. That's what we saw with a lot of these paper products that were compostable, is that they had PFAS in them, right? But, you know, is it actually a system that's going to work? That we have to evaluate anytime you're looking at that change, that piece. And the other piece of it is we have to call out the corporations, because they care enough about greenwashing, and they are also international corporations. So on the one hand, yes, corporate power is real and is the biggest problem in this country. Citizens United and everything behind it is the largest problem in this country. If I were queen of the world, it's the first thing I'd change. But corporations get embarrassed very easily, and they are refilling glass Coke bottles in Europe. And they are using reusable containers at McDonald's in Paris. So we know they can do it, and we have to call them out on this nonsense. And every time that a county or city or town, as Bethany and you guys have done in Marin County, they get something done, we can now trumpet it around the world in a way that we couldn't before. So I have great hope, but we do have to keep, you know, I think a really keen eye on the corporations. That's absolutely correct.
So I do have another question, but I also am cognizant of time and want to make sure that the audience has time. My next question, and then you guys can veto it if you have something more interesting to ask. My next question is, why has the throwaway culture been so normalized? How do we drive that cultural shift? I know we started to talk a bit about that. And how do we really drive behavior change?
Can I answer it so quickly?
Yes, sure.
This is the petrochemical industry's plan B. End of story. That like all the rest of it, we can talk back and forth about convenience. We can talk about any of this that we want, behavior change and all those pieces. You can't even buy, and you don't even have a choice anymore at the grocery store that doesn't include plastic. So
okay.
I'd like to add something there, if I could. Planned and perceived obsolescence are the growth engines of our economy. So we are an economy that we are measured based on our production capacity. Everybody is familiar with GDP. Not everybody may necessarily know how their direct actions and how they're incentivized for those actions tie into that supposed growth. But growth in our country, and the reason why we've been at the top, is because we don't take into consideration disposal costs. Single-use plastics are a wonderful mechanism to actually promote growth, because you use them literally single use. They're used, you purchase them, the company makes their money, they make a new one, and it continues on. It is only one example of many, many types of products that exist that are based on planned or perceived obsolescence that we all have bought into. We only need maybe one pair of shoes. Many of us have more than that in our closet.
I need more pairs of shoes.
But the bottom line is, in reality, we don't need it, right? We buy it and we think we do because these have been normalized in our culture that we should have different outfits, different things to match those outfits. It's all marketing. And yes, convenience may have been marketed, but the reason why it actually has taken such a strong foothold is because it's also a growth driver for GDP growth.
What Susan and I did learn specifically from what the corporations do, and when it comes to like grab and go things in markets, big markets, there's so much grab and go, which our ordinance doesn't apply to. It just can't do that. But what we learned is when they put a barcode on the thing that you're buying, it counts or it registers what container it's in, not just what you're buying from these big companies. So, you know, if you're buying tons of the same thing, they're thinking, okay, the container is working, you know, besides what you're getting in that container. So that just adds to their strength of, you know, saying this is what we need to be doing, and this is making us money.
More reason to vote for your dollars and be so conscious of packaging in your choices.
If I could just jump in and say one more thing here, though, I really hope that we start to recognize this is just one piece of a much bigger problem, which is if you measure an economy based on production, then you make this false perception that you need to substitute from one product to another to be able to continue to capture that financial return. So even the solutions that we discuss, we embed, without even thinking about it, the very problems that will continue us with a different type of human footprint on this planet. We need to think about how we really define what well-being is. And is well-being really tied to having more stuff, or is well-being tied to having stuff that does not harm myself or the rest of the world? We don't necessarily understand and are able to differentiate that, because the concept of well-being being tied to having what I want when I want it still exists. So I hope that people will think about that a little bit, is how much of our economic assumptions have been embedded within our behaviors. Because it's only when you can start to redefine how you want to see an economy that the individual agent's behavior will change within it. You change the goal, you change the outcome.
And I'll just share some anecdotes from our college campuses. We have seen those college campuses ban single-use takeout. So if students want takeout, the only option is our solution, returnable takeout useful. And that has really driven an uptake in returnable takeout packaging on those campuses. We don't see students complaining about it, but it's removing the optionality for folks and redefining what the cultural norm is. They now have a reuse economy or a returnable solution. And so removing that optionality helps to remove any ambiguity or fear of change. So with that, I think we could talk for hours and go in the weeds and change the world and elect someone for president and all that. But you all are here for a reason, and I would love for you all to have a chance to ask your burning questions, both virtually and in the room. Otherwise, I can keep asking questions, but would love to open the floor. And don't be shy, the very nice people. Yes.
First of all, just thank you so much. This is by far the most inspiring panel I have ever attended. On a circular economy. I've been to some in Amsterdam. And just thank you so much for like sharing your strategies and frameworks. Madani, I wrote here framework that I think you're sharing with us on circular choice, which is the power each citizen has for consumer choice, voting, and investment, and it's just really moving. But my question is around stakeholder engagement. So in stakeholder engagement, you mentioned mapping out incentives. I was wondering if you could share some examples of when you conducted a stakeholder engagement mapping exercise and what that activity looked like and who was in the room. And for
Could the folks on the phone hear that?
I could hear most of it.
Yes, okay.
Last segment, but I think I understand, so you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting. So a stakeholder engagement could be a more formal process like you're describing, where you get people in the community together and try to understand what motivates their decision making, ask specific questions. We did not use a formal method in our activities on the Cape. It came out through an informal method by having different types of activities where people would come, and also through town meeting where people would come and stand up and talk against the ban articles that we had. So we indirectly were force fed the incentives or the rationale that people had against the ban. But there are formal mechanisms, and I'm happy to share that if you want to email me with regard to how to do a more formal engagement. You have to include the people that are going to be affected as well, which is one thing that we didn't necessarily do that well. We did not go after the affected parties, which would the municipal ban would have been the government, the local governments, and we didn't do it for the commercial ban, which would have been the restaurants and retailers. And the main reason we didn't is we already knew what their answers were going to be. And so we just wanted to prepare for those. What we wanted is to stack the room with people who were interested in their well-being and not in their revenue. So we focused on what would incentivize someone to vote for a ban article. If they're a person with grandchildren, they may be incentivized purely based on the health of their grandchildren, because their grandchildren may also be talking to them. The Cape has a much older demographic. And we had the benefit of having school teachers and throughout the Cape assisting us by having different modules related to plastic pollution. So they did talk to their families. It could be that the stakeholder engagement could also be with regard to health. It could be someone who has already read about the adverse health effects of plastic consumption. It could be someone who's concerned about animal welfare, because since we are a coastal community, that could also be a reason to reach out to them based on that kind of discussion. So that's where you would figure out, what are the different groups and what are the different messaging. So you would then go to different community organizations with that messaging to help them buy into it based on what incentivizes them, the ultimate outcome you want to see happen. So that's basically, in a very quick way, what I would refer to here. A formal strategy would have been great, but those things typically cost a little bit more money to do. And I come from a nonprofit with no money. In fact, it costs money to be part of my nonprofit because we are completely self-funded.
This isn't really a question, but I just wanted to say, I think we all need to move beyond individual actions. So I, for one, have been bringing my own reusable shopping bag for 4 years. I do a lot of virtuous self-action, but it's not.
And she'll tell you about it too.
difference.
She will tell you about it.
So over the course of the past 20 years, Alison mentioned this briefly, the production of plastic has steadily risen as the fossil fuel industries can be, as housing and transportation. Plastic is the rise in chronic diseases. So, breast cancer, they're all tied to plastic. And if you're interested in learning more about the health effects of plastic, you really have to watch this incredible movie that came out from the Y Foundation. It's called We. Interviews doctors from around the world. One of them is based here in Boston. Her name is Anna Soto. She is the person who connected plastic that are in plastics to breast cancer in 1989. She thought it was going to take 2 years to get being part of plastic, and here we are 34 years later, right? So called Plastic Free Massachusetts. We have over 20 groups now from across the state that are part of Plastic Free Mass, and we are working to pass bans. I helped to pass the single-use plastic shopping bag in Watertown, which is where I live next to Cambridge, in 2016, and went into effect in 2017. We had the same issue with the thick plastic. We rewrote our ordinance so that it doesn't cover that, but there are 159 cities and towns across the state with different single-use plastic comply with this. This is why we need a statewide actions. We cannot continue with individual. I applaud everybody for working on them, but I, for one, I want to see statewide action. I'd love to see national action. And yes, capitalism is the root of all these problems. Thank you.
I'd like to make
I
a
believe-
comment. I'd like to make a comment with regard to what you just noted, that state action is necessary. I'd like to make sure that we all understand that state action cannot occur without individual action occurring first.
Right.
Individual action
That's- yeah.
on the grassroots level is extremely important in order to have state action that actually meets the regulatory mandate. If we look at any policy that's ever been successful in the United States, it's because the societal movement has preceded the policy enactment. So it's very important. Remember, in 1865, slaves were freed, but it was not until 1964 that Black people got equal rights. So
I don't know.
it took that 100 years for people to catch up with what the regulation stated in 1865. You cannot legislate social change. People have to understand what that social change is, and they have to understand it and believe in it in order for it to be appropriately codified. So I think you have to really appreciate grassroots movements. They may be slow, but they create tremendous power because it is the power of the collective that occurs with that.
As someone who's also an amateur historian, and I lead history tours of Boston based on the suffrage movement, I want to say that I study and I see you need to get the policy right in the beginning. If you do not, it continues forward for decades and centuries sometimes.
So just to bring it in a little bit on this.
Thank you.
Well, no, I think here's the thing. There are many of us who enjoy figuring out policy and figuring out what the policy should look like, right? Many of us, not many of us actually, but some of us enjoy that piece. And there are also many of us who, in many things we do in life, we try and find consensus and have buy-in. In this realm, remember that a lot of people who care most about recycling, waste, and plastic make plastic, are running the local recycling systems that we have now that are not working, and are waste companies, right? So when you're talking about any of these issues and figuring out what you should do next, you have to remember that you want to look at what's worked. I joked about California earlier, but that absolutely is a great place to look. Look at what's worked in Canada, what's worked in California, what's worked locally, because that's what the small governments, whether they're county or city or town, are the laboratories for the larger governments, right? The larger government units. So that piece is really important when you're choosing what to work on, because Eileen is right. If you do something that doesn't work well, you're stuck with it for a long time. Had they defined the bottle bill to include all beverages, but then we wouldn't have to work right now to add kombucha and tea and water and liquor and wine to the bottle bill. Had they defined the bottle bill to have the deposit increase automatically if they weren't getting enough bottles back, we wouldn't have to have that fight now. So a well-drafted policy based on other well-drafted policies is important. The other piece is nothing gets done without grassroots, nothing. But you also have to be cognizant of the fact that if you only get something done in your city or town, you're not going to have the deep, pervasive system change that we need to actually change the system. I mean, it's as simple as that. You can't just do this town by town. So it has to be, we need the DEP and the enforcement power of, at the state level, the agencies to make this happen. We need the legislature to act at a certain point if you want to get something really big done. That's all there is to it. There's only so much you can do at city and towns. So the grassroots is imperative, and it's imperative to get the local action done. Don't get me wrong, always really important, but that doesn't mean you don't go bigger. And we really should, it's time to go bigger on all this stuff.
I know Susan and Janice just had,
sorry.
no, I was just gonna say,
Denise
Susan and
has
Janice, do you
her
want to go
hand up.
next?
Yeah, yes, please. I want to say
So
something
sorry.
afterwards, though, please.
Okay, sounds good.
I just have one thing to add. In our community of 250,000 plus, or in our county. What has really helped us too, and this is really important, or has become really important to us, is the relationships that we have with the politicians, town politicians, the supervisors too. That's what helped fast track all of this.
Okay.
Yeah, and I want to just add another thing that I think is really changing and does have huge potential impact, and that is the extended producer responsibility laws that are popping up more and more. We have a very big one in California that was passed. It will take a few years to go into effect, but it's really all those stupid triangles that all these consumer goods companies put on their bottles implies that there's recycling possibilities, and it's just such greenwashing and hogwash. And they are going to be tasked now with proving that it's at least 60% of whatever they're selling in these single use can be recycled. So I do think extended producer responsibility is something that is got to continue to really pick up momentum.
So I'll make my comments very quick. Kirsty and I have different views on the bottle bill for sure. We've discussed this in the past, but I'm not going to bring that up. What I want to point out is two things. One, you get government involved when they know that the sufficient number of the electorate are going to vote positively towards their reelection because they got involved. So it's not like these people are acting on independent volition, that somehow they just have this wonderful desire to somehow make some magical environmental change. They're looking to make that change because a significant number of their constituents also value that change, going back to the power of the individual communities, the local communities. The reason why we have the state now intervening with basically a state ban for state offices, is because I believe there's sufficient expression on the part of the towns in the state of Massachusetts that they are open to this kind of reduction. I don't think they're just doing this irrespective of whether this is going to hamper their reelection capabilities. So I think it's really important to connect that dot. But the other thing is, even when you have policy, it's not a one and done issue. We have to look at the fact that policies are created at particular points in time based on the information that's accessible to us. The problem that we have is that we think of policy as a one and done. It checks the box and we move on to something else. We don't live in a continuous improvement society where we go back to see if that policy meets its initial intention. In some cases, perhaps there have been, but in general, that's not the case. Continuous improvement is actually a part of sustainability. You go back and ensure that your sustainability objectives that were the basis of that initial policy are continuing to be met over time. So we have to even think to ourselves, does a bottle bill actually promote the false perception that recycling works? Or is a bottle bill actually a preemptive measure that eliminates single use? I leave that to another debate at another time, because I don't think that this is time for us to talk about that. But we have to think to ourselves whether the policy is actually indicative of the outcome that we wish to see.
Any other questions from folks in the room or online? Yes.
So I do not put myself forward as an expert on what's happened in Europe, but I have lots of friends that I call and ask questions a lot. So I can get you more information in case there's anything you want to dig into more so. Because Europe has been acting as a union, the more progressive portions of Europe who are more ahead on these issues have pulled along a lot of other folks. And there have been a few different mechanisms that they put in place. One of them is a bottle bill, which is requiring that there's a deposit on glass, plastic, and aluminum beverage containers. That deposit makes a person bring the bottle or can back so that they get the deposit back. And then there's a fee that's paid by the producers to make sure that the bottles and cans move and are actually brought back to be recycled. It keeps bottles and cans separate from each other. They're sorted, so they actually get recycled. They're not in with the curbside recycling. So that has made a huge difference, and those materials are getting recycled back into bottles and cans. There's also a target that they have to meet. If the target is not met, then the program has to be adjusted, and the target is 90%. So as a result of that, beverage companies are in charge and responsible for the end life of, if you want to use the word life, of bottles and cans. As a result, it makes more sense for them to look at reusable, refillable systems, because reusable refillable systems are cheaper if they're done at scale. In other words, if you have a bottle that's used 20 times, a beer bottle that's used 20 times, that's cheaper than a single-use bottle if you're responsible for it. Here, beverage companies are not largely responsible for the beverage bottles. They also have extended producer for responsibility systems, as was discussed in the California system. Those bottle bills are a type of extended producer responsibility, meaning the producer is responsible for the packaging and where the packaging ends up. Extended producer responsibility systems only pay for the recycling and the reuse if they're being reused of the system. So for the packaging, they have not been found to actually reduce packaging in the world. The other problem that can happen, and I'm worried about the California bill, we'll have to see. I think the agency is working really hard to do it well. But the problem with extended producer responsibility is sometimes burning it counts as recycling, which has been part of the problem in Europe. Europe's not perfect. They burn a lot of their waste, okay? The other thing that's happening in Europe now, the European Union is looking at definitions and requirements to reuse and refill. And so that means beverage container refill. That means companies like USEFULL are moving forward because they know they're going to be required, takeout places are going to be required to use reusable containers. So that's incentivizing a lot of companies to move forward, like Vital and others. Right? And then the other thing that's happening is there's a lot of great reuse around secondary packaging. So we think about packages like the beverage container or the cookie box. 60% of the packaging that's really out there is secondary packaging. It's the big tray that the vegetables come in. So in Europe, that is also being looked at and regulated already. For instance, there's a company in France. They actually have branches here in the United States. They have big produce trays that are foldable and stackable and washable and repairable. They're made of plastic, but they use them for decades instead of cardboard boxes every time. So those are some of the things that are happening. And then the other piece that's happening in France and other places as the regulations have been improved is requiring reuse in closed systems like universities, like what USEFULL is trying to do, like hospitals, like old folks' homes, like cafeterias, requiring reuse there. And then also much more refill in closed systems, like if I deliver beer to a restaurant every week and taking those bottles back and refilling them and bringing them back with the beer in the other time. So those closed loop systems that already exist, they're trying to prioritize that refill, and then they'll move to other systems, hopefully. So not all of this has happened or a done deal in Europe. They're definitely working on it, but it is about regulations to force corporations to act differently. And when you do that, they do, but you have to have transparency, you have to have reporting, you have to have enforcement, and you have to have an electorate, folks who vote for those politicians to do the right thing, which is absolutely the point that we were just making. So it's happening in Europe. They're way ahead of us on many things. Germany has got their refill for beverage system is something like 48% of the market. So it's real. They're taking back, glass yogurt containers and all that stuff. So it's happening, but they have a long way to go, and we have much further to go, I would say.
To add a little bit to,
And again, it's not perfect. They're burning, you know, they've got a terrible incineration problem, and then you have to landfill the ash. So it's not that everything's done perfectly. And again, EPR is only good for paying for the recycling system. EPR doesn't actually cause reduction, we found. Reloop in Europe did a lecture on that recently. So we know that we need a variety of different systems to make these pieces work, but they're definitely doing it in a much more thoughtful way there than we've managed to do here thus far.
May I add one thing about the producer responsibility, extended producer responsibility? The thing that we have to take into consideration is what is the incentive of the corporation to take responsibility for its waste stream? Unless there is a suitable financial or some other adversely impactful mechanism at play, all that you're going to see is a way of using this to obscure the continuation of business as usual. It's in my opinion, it's really important that we just not somehow think that this entity that has not been responsible up to this point and has been primarily focused on profit maximization and externalizing costs as much as possible is not going to find some sort of loophole within an extended producer responsibility policy to be able to continue business as usual, but it'll be masked from the general consumer. I'm a little bit.
That's why, yeah, that's right. That's right. And that's why the PROs shouldn't be in charge, right?
Do you all know what PROs are?
So the producer responsibility organization is a nonprofit put together by corporations in whatever realm you're talking about. So if you're talking about packaging, for instance, that's one way of doing it. You could do it for beverages, you could do it for carpets, you could do it for TVs, electronics. Producer responsibility can be used to manage waste or pay for the management of waste with any of those systems. But you don't want the corporations, to her point, perfectly true. You don't want the corporations to come in and say, this is how we're going to recycle the carpet. No worries, nothing for you to worry about. They fucked it up the first time. Why would you ever trust them now? So that's absolutely the primary point that I make every time is do not tell me that the PRO who is trying to save money and always look at that, as we just talked about, that corporate greed that is driving, measuring GDP and all those other pieces, that's not who you want to set the rules. You don't want them to set the rules for recyclability. You don't want them to set the rules for toxicity. You sure as heck don't want them to set the rules for eco-modulated fees and what they're paying and in what situation. So that's really important. And that's one of the things they've done here in this country, in Colorado, most definitely with the EPR bill for packaging. I'm worried about California. I'm not that in love with the Oregon one either. So if it's not done right, it can cause some problems.
And that's an issue we have right now because they are putting companies on these committees. And I just think that people should be at least aware of it so that they can see the difference between government greenwashing and truly moving the dial forward. So thank you.
So one last question, and then I say we wrap up and chit chat. Deal? Okay. Do you want to go for it?
Hey, that's on the idea of
So that's,
how do you think about that?
so what's interesting, so again,
Mind repeating the question for us? We can't hear anything.
so he asked, why doesn't exactly to your point, why doesn't the corporation just pass the fee on to the consumer? How does an eco-modulated fee actually change behavior? That's absolutely, that and who's in charge are the two issues that are always kind of the crux of the matter. In places, and again, it's all how you do something. In the places where they have put extended producer responsibility for packaging systems in place to pay for that end life of the recycling and the disposal, like Canada, like Europe, there's been a very small increase per item in the actual good. So there's been there was research done by a professor out of Canada that turned out to have been paid for by the corporations that said there's going to be a huge increase. Goods are going to be so expensive. That did not happen. There's no evidence of that. It does not do that. That being said, it does not actually reduce the amount of packaging though either. And there was definitely a transition to plastic that would happen. So I'm not saying that EPR is a great thing, but it doesn't cost the consumer more money, or it turns out to be very minimal, and we're not even a penny per item type of
I'm going to
increase.
jump in here and just say something that I think is really important to take into consideration. It will cost the consumer money if it's a product that the consumer has to have. It depends on the elasticity of the consumer, using an economic term here. So the more inelastic I am, the more I have to have a particular product, the easier it is for a corporation to pass on the cost to me, because regardless of what the price is, I'm going to still buy it. The more elastic, excuse me, the more elastic.
But I'm just talking about the real data. Like, you're absolutely correct, and that's absolutely true. But I'm just talking about the actual looking at the price before and the price after there was in a sense.
So those are in what we would call elastic markets, basically markets where the consumer is relatively price sensitive. So because of that, because there's a lot of competition potentially in that particular product, the producer is bearing some portion of the cost. That's why they're not seeing that much of an impact to the consumer, because it is actually affecting the cost to the producer. They may be cutting back costs somewhere else, but I think we have to differentiate where and how and the mechanism that's being used. But one point I'd like to piggyback that you just made, Kirsty, is that there is a paucity of information about the positions that we are all talking about here on this panel, because the majority of information that's out there is paid for by those who have the greatest financial gain. And so that obscures a lot of these issues. There's so many articles out there. Even McKinsey came up with one not that long ago that basically said plastic has a lower life cycle footprint than paper. So this is an issue because people are not familiar with something like the American Chemical Council, which you and I know is a plastic industry lobby. It sounds like an independent entity, but these are the places that are churning out the papers, the research, the things that hit the magazines, the way that they're able to then hire people who have names like McKinsey as though somehow they're a rubber stamp on the fact that plastic is not bad. We don't have that kind of money when it comes to fighting our cause. And that's a big issue. And I don't think people understand that.
That's definitely true.
So I love the passion from tonight, and I think we all could keep going and going and going. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. Perhaps we can throw in the chat or do an email follow-up with contact information for the panelists. There's a wealth of knowledge in this room, virtually and in person. And I have to say that this gives me great hope for the future, that there are thought leaders like this coming together to communicate. And I hope we can beat California in being the leaders on this.
I'm happy to catch up.
Exactly. So thank you all so much for joining, and hopefully Eric will be doing more sessions like this and keep the momentum going. So thank you. And thank you, panelists, so much.
Thanks
Thank you
for having
all.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. One last round of applause for the panel. Wow, what a great dynamic conversation and such a relevant topic. Thank you, Alison, for moderating, and everyone on the panel. Just a couple quick announcements. Tomorrow's the last day of Circular Cities Week. We have one more event at Chapel U, Boston. We do have a wait list for it, but I'm going to open up 3 more tickets for anyone who's in the room. So if people want to come to that tomorrow, let me know, come find me, and I can add you in the behind the scenes on that one. We also are going to have our monthly Circular Economy Club meeting on November 15th. There's information, there's a QR code on that in the front as well. And feel free to have some more crackers. They're from Brewers, who was on the panel on Monday, and wine and beer. Feel free to mingle a little bit, and then we'll close and clean out the room and space. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right.